Behind the Velvet Curtain, the untold lives of R&B's most powerful women. They stood in the spotlight like untouchable goddesses, voices soaring, diamonds blazing, the world bowing at their feet. But behind the Velvet Curtain lived stories no camera ever caught: broken contracts, buried trauma, fame-induced isolation, and the silent wars that shaped R&B's most powerful women. These legends didn't just survive the industry, they paid for greatness with pieces of themselves the public never saw. Tonight, Legends of Black Excellence pulls back that curtain. If you're ready to hear the truths, success tried to silence, hit like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts, because what you're about to learn will rewrite everything you thought you knew. Lauryn Hill. Behind the Velvet Curtain, Lauryn Hill's ascent looked almost unreal. A rare figure whose voice, intellect, and conviction seemed to rewrite the rules of R&B in a single stroke. When The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill arrived in 1998, it sold over 420,000 copies in its first week and earned 5 Grammy Awards in one night, including Album of the Year. She was just 23. To the outside world, this was a coronation. But behind the scenes, the speed and scale of that success brought a different kind of storm: relentless schedules, invasive attention, and a level of expectation that no human being could comfortably carry. Away from the cameras, Hill found herself entangled in disputes over creative credit and authorship related to the very album that had made her a legend. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court, but the process highlighted something deeper: a growing disillusionment with how the music business treated art ownership and integrity. Interviews in the years that followed hinted at her frustration with a system that measured everything in units and charts while demanding more and more of her image, her time, and her private life. Rather than surrender to that machinery, she chose distance, and in doing so became one of the most intriguing disappearances in modern popular music. Her re-emergence with MTV Unplugged No. 2.0 in 2002 offered a raw, unvarnished counterpoint to the polished mythology around her. Gone were the ornate productions. In their place stood a lone guitar, a worn voice, and long-spoken interludes about faith, fear, motherhood, and identity. The project did not replicate the commercial impact of her debut, but it revealed something rarer: a woman refusing to let a market define her worth. It was not a comeback engineered for radio. It was a document of someone choosing truth over perfection, even if that truth sounded cracked, tired, or unresolved. Hill continues to perform on her own terms with tours and special appearances that still sell out despite the absence of a traditional follow-up studio album. Each performance feels less like nostalgia and more like a reminder of the standard she set both musically and morally for what it means to protect one's soul in a profit-driven industry. Her story behind the Velvet Curtain is not simply about withdrawal. It is about reclaiming authorship over her life and legacy. That choice, as much as her groundbreaking records, is what makes Lauryn Hill one of the most powerful and mysterious women ever to shape R&B. Mary J. Blige. Behind the Velvet Curtain of R&B stands Mary J. Blige, a woman whose voice carries the weight of 1,000 unspoken battles. Crowned the queen of hip-hop soul, she entered the industry in the early 1990s with a sound raw enough to cut through an era dominated by polished pop. But behind the chart-topping hits and diamond-studded awards shows was a young woman struggling to survive the chaos of her own life. Blige has openly spoken about growing up in a housing project in Yonkers, surrounded by addiction, violence, and instability realities that carved themselves into her earliest recordings. When What's the 411 ignited her career in 1992, success offered visibility, but not safety. The world saw her rising. She still felt herself drowning. As fame intensified, the battles she fought internally grew sharper. Blige has recounted her struggles with alcoholism and drug dependency during her early career, describing it as a slow erosion of self that nearly consumed her. Equally painful were the relationships marked by emotional volatility and physical abuse, chapters she later revealed in interviews and in her critically acclaimed documentary, Mary J. Blige's My Life. These experiences shaped not only her music, but her very identity. Every album from My Life 1994 to No More Drama 2001 reads like a diary of survival, tracing the arc from despair to determination. For millions of fans, her honesty became a lifeline. For Blige, it was a way to stay alive. Yet resilience eventually found a foothold. With mentorship from figures like Diddy and powerful creative partnerships through the late 90s and early 2000s, Blige began climbing out of the emotional wreckage she once thought permanent. She embraced therapy, sobriety, and self-reinvention. Albums like The Breakthrough 2005, which debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, selling over 727,000 copies in its first week, marked not just commercial triumph, but personal victory. Her music shifted from cries for escape to declarations of power, resilience, and self-love. Through every reinvention, she carried the unmistakable rasp of someone who had earned every note. Mary J. Blige ultimately transformed her pain into legacy. She made history in 2018 as the first person ever nominated for both Best Supporting Actress and Best Original Song at the Academy Awards, solidifying her place not only as a singer but as a cultural force. Her story behind the velvet curtain is not defined by the darkness she endured, but by the fire she forged from it. Mary J. Blige did not simply survive. She rewrote survival into an anthem, proving that power can rise from places the world tries to silence. If Lauryn Hill embodies mystery, Blige embodies endurance, a voice that broke, healed, and came back stronger, echoing through the heart of R&B with unstoppable force. Aaliyah. Behind the velvet curtain of R&B, Aaliyah stood as a symbol of grace, quiet, elegant, and impossibly self-possessed for someone who entered the industry at just 12 years old. Her debut album, Age Ain't Nothing But a Number 1994, introduced a sound that blended whisper-smooth vocals with a mysterious aura the industry had never seen in someone so young. But that same album emerged from a complex environment where adults, executives, and producers shaped every detail of her public identity. While the world saw poise, Aaliyah herself was navigating the difficult balance between artistic ambition and a business that often demanded more than it gave. Her family later in interviews described how fiercely they protected her, aware of how vulnerable a rising star could be in a powerful and competitive industry. As her career grew, Aaliyah found creative freedom working with Timbaland and Missy Elliott, two collaborators who helped her grow into the confident, forward-thinking artist listeners still revere today. With One in a Million, 1996, she sold over 8 million copies worldwide, reshaping the sound of late 90s R&B with futuristic productions and choreography that made her a defining visual icon. Yet even at the height of her success, she remained unusually private, choosing silence over spectacle. Friends and collaborators consistently noted that she protected her inner life with deliberate care, understanding that fame often blurred boundaries. This sense of guardedness became part of her mystique, beautiful, intriguing, and disciplined enough to rise above industry noise. In 2001, Aaliyah stepped into full adulthood as she filmed Queen of the Damned and prepared to release her self-titled album. That project would debut at #2 on the Billboard 200, revealing a matured voice and artistic independence. But behind the professional milestone was the pressure of global fame pressing in faster than ever. Even in interviews shortly before her passing, she spoke about feeling the intensity of expectations around her, expressing a desire for both creative risk and personal grounding. She was navigating a transition that few artists manage successfully, a shift from prodigy to fully realized woman in control of her craft. Her death on August 25, 2001, in a plane crash in the Bahamas, shocked the world. Investigations confirmed the aircraft had been overloaded and that the pilot lacked proper certification. The tragedy ended a life and career ascending at extraordinary speed, leaving behind an ache that remains palpable decades later. Aaliyah's legacy is not defined by the unanswered questions that followed, but by the revolutionary imprint she left before turning 23. Behind the velvet curtain, she embodied both fragility and strength, a young woman who reshaped the sound of a generation and whose absence is still felt like a note cut short too soon. Janet Jackson. Behind the velvet curtain of R&B and pop, Janet Jackson's story is one of brilliance constantly negotiated through control. Born into the Jackson dynasty, she grew up not as an ordinary child, but as part of an empire already shaped by her brother Michael's global fame. By the time she was a teenager, Janet was working on television and recording music, yet every move was scrutinized, directed, and often second-guessed by managers, executives, and even family. It wasn't until Control 1986 and Rhythm Nation 1814-1989 that she shattered those expectations, selling millions of records worldwide and proving she was not a shadow, but a force. These albums weren't just hits. They were declarations of autonomy from a woman determined to write her own narrative in an industry that preferred her as an extension of someone else. With success came an even tighter grip on her image. Record labels, advertisers, and broadcasters saw Janet as a carefully curated brand, strong, sensual, but always within boundaries they found marketable. Her artistry pushed against those confines. Janet, 1993, and the Velvet Rope. 1997 explored desire, trauma, mental health, and identity with a rawness rarely granted to Black women in mainstream pop. She addressed homophobia, depression, and self-worth at a time when these conversations were far from safe. Yet while critics praised her courage and depth, the industry often tried to package those themes into something more palatable, more easily consumed, a constant tug-of-war between her truth and their comfort. Then came the 2004 Super Bowl halftime show, and the illusion of control shattered. A split-second wardrobe malfunction during her performance with Justin Timberlake triggered a cultural firestorm. Federal complaints flooded and the FCC issued massive fines, and Janet's videos were reportedly blacklisted from key networks and radio conglomerates. Careers are often built on controversy, but in this case, she bore the brunt of public outrage while her male counterpart emerged largely unscathed. For many observers, it became a chilling example of how quickly a Black woman's image could be punished, censored, and sacrificed to protect institutions and reputations more powerful than her own. Yet even in the aftermath, Janet refused to vanish. She continued releasing albums, touring, and refining her sound, earning her place among the best-selling recording artists in history with over 100 million records sold worldwide. Behind the velvet curtain, her journey is not simply a tale of scandal, it is a study in endurance under surveillance. Janet Jackson's life reveals how image can become both weapon and prison. Carefully constructed, brutally policed, yet ultimately reclaimed by the very woman the system tried to control. Toni Braxton. Behind the velvet curtain of R&B, Toni Braxton's story hums with a striking contradiction, a woman whose voice generated tens of millions of dollars while her own bank account slipped into crisis twice. In the 1990s, she was everywhere. Her self-titled debut in 1993 and Secrets in 1996 made her one of the decade's defining vocalists, with songs like Unbreak My Heart and Breathe Again, turning heartbreak into platinum. She won 7 Grammy Awards over her career and sold more than 70 million records worldwide, the kind of numbers that usually scream untouchable wealth. Yet away from the spotlight, the arithmetic didn't add up. In 1998, at the height of her fame, Braxton filed for her first bankruptcy. Later in interviews and her memoir, she explained that her recording contract paid her only a tiny royalty per album after recouping costs for promotion videos, touring wardrobe, and other expenses the label controlled. She famously revealed that after selling more than 10 million copies early on, her royalty check was barely enough to buy regular household items. The glamorous image designer gowns, luxury cars, high-end videos was largely financed and then billed back to her. On paper, she was a star. On the balance sheet, she was deeply in debt. After renegotiating her deal, returning to the charts and building new revenue streams through touring and Broadway, it seemed she had escaped the financial trap. But life behind the scenes took another turn. In the late 2000s, Braxton faced serious health problems, including a diagnosis of lupus and microvascular angina conditions that affected her ability to perform. A Las Vegas residency meant to be a stable financial foundation was cut short due to these issues. In 2010, she filed for bankruptcy again, citing medical bills and lost performance income among her burdens. This time the strain came not from ignorance, but from the brutal intersection of illness and an entertainment economy that often punishes vulnerability. Yet Toni Braxton's narrative is not simply one of loss. She rebuilt again through television. Braxton family values, stage work, new albums, and advocacy for those living with lupus. Her journey exposes a seldom discussed truth. Even the most celebrated women in R&B can be trapped by contracts, expectations, and unforeseen crises they did not create. Behind the velvet curtain, Toni Braxton stands as both cautionary tale and symbol of endurance, a reminder that the price of $1 million voice can be far more complicated than the world ever sees. Sadadu. Behind the velvet curtain of R&B, Sadadu remains one of the most captivating enigmas in modern music. From the moment Diamond Life arrived in 1984, selling more than 6 million copies worldwide, she established a presence unlike anyone else, cool, hypnotic, untouchable. Her voice floated somewhere between whisper and confession, carrying secrets listeners could feel even if they couldn't name them. Yet, as the world fell in love with her elegance, Sade seemed to retreat further from the glare of celebrity. She possessed that rarest form of power, the ability to disappear without losing relevance to protect her inner world, while her music conquered continents. The mystery surrounding her was not manufactured. It was a shield. In interviews, Sade has spoken about how fame weighed on her, a pressure that grew heavier after the global success of albums like Promise 1985 and Stronger Than Pride 1988. While critics praised her for remaining poised and private, the truth behind the curtain was more fragile. She experienced periods of emotional exhaustion and isolation, acknowledging that she sometimes struggled with the emotional cost of touring publicity and the constant demand for reinvention. For an artist whose work was rooted in intimacy and honesty, the machinery of fame felt invasive, overwhelming, and at times incompatible with her spirit. As the decade turned, Sade chose absence over burnout. Her deliberate retreats, most notably the long hiatuses between albums, such as the 8-year gap before Lovers Rock 2000 and the 10-year silence leading to Soldier of Love 2010, were not acts of defiance, but of survival. During these years, she focused on family privacy and healing. She chose small towns over red carpets, long drives over photo shoots, stillness over spectacle. Fans speculated, magazines searched, the industry waited. But Sade moved at the pace of her own heart, not the pace of headlines. And when she returned, each release felt like an offering rather than an obligation, polished, purposeful, and undeniably hers. Sadeadu's power lies not in omnipresence, but in restraint. She sold more than 50 million records worldwide, yet refused the structures that often consume artists of her stature. Behind the velvet curtain, she safeguarded her sanity, her softness, and her autonomy, a rare trilogy in the world of music. Her story is not about hiding, it is about choosing. By stepping away from fame, she preserved the purity of her art and remained a timeless icon precisely because she never allowed the world to own her completely. In a culture obsessed with visibility, Sade proved that mystery can be the strongest form of truth. Brandy Norwood. Behind the velvet curtain, Brandy Norwood's rise looked almost storybook. At just 15 years old, she released her debut album, Brandy 1994, which sold over 6 million copies worldwide and turned her into one of R&B's brightest young stars. Soon after, Moesha made her a household name, and by her late teens, she had become a symbol of youthful perfection, marketed carefully as the ideal role model for a generation of young girls. Yet behind the rehearsed smiles and polished image was a teenager carrying the weight of an entire brand. Growing up under constant public scrutiny, Brandy learned early that mistakes were not allowed. Vulnerability was discouraged, and her identity often belonged more to the industry than to herself. As her fame grew, that pressure only deepened. Brandy spoke openly in later interviews about struggling with depression and self-doubt during the peak of her early career. Her life was mapped out by schedules, expectations, and cameras that never blinked, leaving little room for the normal messiness of adolescence. Even her relationships were subjected to public judgment, leading to emotional strain she wasn't prepared to navigate. She admitted that the need to appear perfect at all times left her feeling disconnected from her true self, creating a quiet internal fracture beneath the polished veneer of superstardom. Then came 2006, a year that marked a turning point. Brandy was involved in a tragic car accident in Los Angeles that resulted in the death of another driver. While she was not charged with a crime and the case was ruled an accident, the emotional impact on her was profound. Brandy later described this period as one of the darkest chapters of her life, facing overwhelming grief, anxiety, and public scrutiny. Hollywood's glare made healing even harder. Cameras followed her pain headlines, dissected her trauma, and the world expected her to return to normal as though nothing had happened. No award, no performance, no spotlight could mute the psychological scar left behind. Yet through the shadows, Brandy rebuilt herself piece by piece. Her album 2012 reflected a matured artist reclaiming her voice after years of silence, while her performances on Broadway and television showcased a creative resilience few could have predicted. Behind the velvet curtain, Brandy's journey is not defined by tragedy, but by transformation. She is a reminder that even the brightest teen stars can struggle beneath the pressure of perfection, and that survival, not image, is the true measure of strength. Kelly Rowland. Behind the velvet curtain of R&B and pop, Kelly Rowland's journey reveals a quiet strength forged in the shadows of extraordinary fame. As a founding member of Destiny's Child, one of the best-selling girl groups of all time with more than 60 million records sold, Kelly grew up under the unforgiving glow of global attention. The group's harmonies were seamless, their image immaculate. But inside that polished unity was a young artist learning to navigate an industry that rarely allows more than one woman in any group to shine equally. From the beginning, the machine around them subtly positioned her as supportive secondary safe, a role she never asked for, yet one she was constantly expected to inhabit. When Destiny's Child disbanded and each member stepped into the world alone, Kelly entered a battlefield of comparisons she had never sought. Interviews, headlines, and critics repeatedly framed her work next to Beyoncé's, something Kelly later admitted caused years of emotional struggle. Her honesty in the 2013 song Dirty Laundry revealed the shadow she carried, the pressure of watching a friend become one of the most visible entertainers in the world while fighting to define her own worth. It wasn't jealousy, it was the exhaustion of having her identity filtered through someone else's spotlight, as though her talent only existed in relation to another's success. Yet despite the weight of those comparisons, Kelly Rowland built a career marked by versatility and resilience. Her debut solo album, Simply Deep, 2002, sold over 2.5 million copies worldwide, while singles like Motivation topped the Billboard Hot R&B Hip-Hop chart for 7 consecutive weeks. She explored dance, R&B, pop, and electronic music with a fluidity many artists struggle to master. Still, the narrative of being the other member of Destiny's Child lingered in media discourse, a reminder of how the industry often limits the space afforded to Black women, especially those who emerge from groups with a breakout star. But Kelly Rowland never surrendered her identity. She became a mentor on The X Factor, an advocate for maternal health, and an author who speaks openly about confidence, self-worth, and artistic autonomy. Her music grew richer, her presence deeper, her confidence steadier. Behind the velvet curtain, Kelly's story is not one of overshadowing, but of illumination. She carved her path with grace, refusing to be diminished by comparison. Instead, she proved that worth is not defined by the brightest light in the room, but by the unwavering fire within. Faith Evans. Behind the velvet curtain of 1990s R&B, Faith Evans found herself standing at the crossroads of one of the most turbulent eras in American music. She entered the industry as a gifted vocalist, signed to Bad Boy Records, her voice blending gospel warmth with street soul grit. Her debut album, Faith 1995, introduced her as a rising star on the East Coast scene. But behind the acclaim and platinum plaques was a world rapidly spiraling into chaos, a world she had never asked to be part of. Faith didn't choose conflict. She walked into a storm that was already brewing, fed by media headlines, rumor mills, and a rap rivalry that was escalating beyond anyone's control. Her marriage to Christopher the Notorious B.I.G. Wallace placed her directly in the eye of the East Coast-West Coast feud, an environment charged with ego, territorial pride, and industry manipulation. Faith has repeatedly stated in interviews and in her memoir that she wanted no involvement in the drama, yet her name was pulled into the narrative after false rumors circulated linking her to Tupac Shakur. Tupac referenced the allegation in his music, and the media amplified it, turning Faith into an unwilling symbol of tension between two coasts. These were not just lyrical jabs. They were moments that deepened a cultural conflict already teetering on the edge. Through all of it, Faith remained adamant she had no desire to fuel the fire that others were stoking for attention and power. As the feud intensified, the stakes grew tragically high. Faith witnessed firsthand how fast lives could be swallowed by fame's darker currents. In September 1996, Tupac was killed in Las Vegas. Just 6 months later, in March 1997, Biggie was murdered in Los Angeles. Two devastating losses, icons gone before age 26, left Faith navigating grief on a public stage. While promoting Biggie's posthumous album Life After Death, she carried not only the weight of widowhood, but the responsibility of raising their son, CJ, amid global mourning. Her duet I'll Be Missing You, released later that year, became a healing anthem, topping the Billboard Hot 100 for 11 consecutive weeks and offering solace to millions who felt the magnitude of those losses. Faith Evans' story behind the velvet curtain is one of survival amid forces far larger than herself. She rebuilt her career with strength, releasing albums, writing a memoir, and eventually creating The King and I 2017, a collaborative project honoring Biggie's legacy. She did not emerge from the rivalry as a combatant, but as a witness to both tragedy and transformation. Her journey is a reminder that even in the most volatile chapters of music history, some artists stand not for conflict, but for resilience. Faith Evans lived through a war she never intended to join and came out with a voice that remains unshaken. Fantasia Barrino. Behind the velvet curtain of modern R&B Fantasia, Barrino's story begins like a fairy tale rewritten in real time. When she won American Idol in 2004 at only 19 years old, her voice, raw, gospel-rooted, unmistakably powerful, captured the nation instantly. Her debut single, I Believe, entered the Billboard Hot 100 at number 1, a historic first for a new Idol winner. To millions watching, she seemed destined for a life of uninterrupted triumph. But success, especially when it arrives overnight, often hides fractures beneath its shine. While the world celebrated her victory, Fantasia was still carrying the unhealed wounds of poverty, teen motherhood, and years of instability the cameras never showed. Beyond the spotlight, her personal life was far more complicated than the glamorous narratives built around talent show winners. In her memoir, Fantasia revealed that she lacked financial literacy early in her career, leaving her dependent on advisors who mismanaged her earnings. By 2009, she faced foreclosure on her home, a symbolic reminder of how quickly fortunes can unravel when fame comes before foundation. Add to that the emotional demands of supporting extended family members and the relentless pressure to be the miracle everyone expected, and the weight became unbearable. Fantasia later admitted that the gap between her public persona and private struggles grew so large it felt impossible to bridge. In 2010, overwhelmed by stress exhaustion and a series of personal crises amplified by tabloid scrutiny, Fantasia was hospitalized after an overdose that she later confirmed was a suicide attempt. Her recovery was not instant. It was a long, painful climb marked by therapy, introspection, and the difficult work of reshaping her boundaries. The public saw the headlines, but Fantasia lived the silence afterward. The questions about her worth, the fear of disappointing fans, and the heavy shadow of returning to an industry that rarely allows women, especially black women, the space to break down and rebuild without judgment. Yet Fantasia Barrino emerged from that darkness with a resilience that redefined her legacy. Her 2013 album, Side Effects of You, debuted at number 2 on the Billboard R&B chart, signaling not just a commercial comeback, but an emotional rebirth. She stepped into Broadway roles, reignited her touring career, and found stability on her own terms. Behind the velvet curtain, Fantasia's journey is not a tragedy, it is a testimony. She survived systems that failed her, expectations that crushed her, and moments that nearly ended her. And in reclaiming her life piece by piece, she proved that survival, when sung with truth, can be the most powerful performance of all. Denise "Vanity" Matthews. Behind the velvet curtain of 1980s pop and R&B, Denise "Vanity" Matthews embodied a different kind of stardom, magnetic, provocative, and impossible to ignore. As the lead singer of Vanity 6, created and produced by Prince, she became an icon of the era's neon-drenched sensuality. On stage, she commanded attention with an effortless confidence, her image crafted to electrify audiences and challenge the boundaries of what a female performer could be. Yet the seduction that defined her public identity was a costume, not a confession. Behind the glamour, Vanity bore the weight of an industry that expected her to play a role she never fully claimed as her own. Her relationship with Prince was creatively transformative but also fraught with tension, reflecting the industry's broader habit of shaping young female artists through male visionaries. Vanity later revealed in interviews that she often felt molded more as an image than as a person, a sensation that deepened as she pursued solo music and film roles. As the demands of fame intensified, so did her struggles. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Vanity battled substance addiction, an issue she spoke openly about, describing it as a cycle that numbed both emotional pain and the pressure to maintain the persona the public expected. The glamorous stage lights concealed a reality marked by instability, health scares, and moments of profound despair. In 1994, after a near-fatal kidney failure linked to years of drug abuse, an event she recounted as a turning point, Vanity walked away from the entertainment industry entirely. She auctioned off memorabilia, distanced herself from her past image, and openly acknowledged the toll her lifestyle had taken on her physically and spiritually. It was a dramatic rupture, but not an escape. It was a rebirth. She devoted herself to Christianity, speaking at churches, and sharing candid, unfiltered accounts of her past as a warning and a testimony. Her transformation was not performative. It was an act of survival in a world that had once nearly consumed her. Denise Matthews lived the remainder of her life far from the cameras that once defined her. She continued to struggle with chronic kidney issues, ultimately undergoing a transplant in 1997. Yet she carried herself with a gratitude and clarity that felt worlds apart from the Vanity persona. When she passed away in 2016 at age 57, tributes celebrated not just the icon she had been, but the woman she became, resilient, honest, and unafraid to confront the shadows she once lived within. Behind the velvet curtain, Vanity's story is one of transformation, a journey from image to identity, from chaos to faith, from the constructed fantasy of the 1980s to a truth she fought hard to reclaim. Jill Scott. Behind the velvet curtain of neo-soul, Jill Scott emerged as a beacon of warmth, her voice lush, tender, and unafraid to celebrate the fullness of Black womanhood. From the moment Who Is Jill Scott Words and Sounds Volume 1 debuted in 2000, she became the embodiment of soul with substance blending poetry, jazz, and R&B into a sound both intimate and expansive. Her public image radiated confidence and compassion as though she carried sunlight in her chest. But behind the microphone was a woman whose personal life did not always mirror the serenity of her artistry. Scott's journey would reveal how even those who sing of love with depth and generosity can face emotional terrain far rougher than their lyrics suggest. Her first marriage to Lizelle Williams ended quietly in 2007, but her second, briefly to drummer Little John Roberts, unfolded under sharper public scrutiny. After announcing their separation months after the birth of their son, Scott found herself pulled into conversations she had never wished to host publicly. Tabloids speculated, fans debated, and the narrative around her relationships grew louder than the artistry she had long centered. She later shared in interviews that these breakups felt deeply and lived publicly left emotional scars she carried into her work. Divorce for her was not just a personal ending, but a reshaping of how she understood partnership boundaries and trust. Compounding the pain were the judgments she faced surrounding her appearance. Despite her global acclaim, critics and internet commentators frequently targeted her body, weaponizing stereotypes and expectations placed on Black women in entertainment. Scott refused to shrink herself physically or artistically, but the scrutiny took a toll. She spoke openly about moments of loneliness and isolation within an industry that often prioritizes narrow beauty standards over talent. Yet her resilience was rooted not in denial, but in honesty. She confronted the pressure not by hiding, but by transforming it into art. Songs like Hate on Me and When I Wake Up became declarations of self-worth forged in the fire of external judgment. Jill Scott's healing did not come from silence, it came from creation. Every album, from Beautifully Human to The Light of the Sun, reflects stages of her emotional evolution: heartbreak, rebuilding, empowerment, clarity. She turned personal upheaval into musical therapy for both herself and the millions who found refuge in her voice. Behind the velvet curtain, Jill Scott is not simply a soul singer. She is a survivor who learned to alchemize pain into poetry. Her story is a reminder that the most radiant artists often shine not because their lives are unblemished, but because they refuse to let the shadows swallow their light. Carrie Hilson. Behind the velvet curtain of 2000s R&B and pop, Carrie Hilson emerged as one of the most promising new voices of her era. Before stepping into the spotlight, she was already a powerhouse behind the scenes, a songwriter contributing to hits for Britney Spears, Mary J. Blige, and Ciara. By the time she released her debut album, In a Perfect World, in 2009, she was positioned as a rising star with a sharp pen and a distinct sound. The album debuted at number 4 on the Billboard 200, and singles like Knock You Down stormed global charts. But just as quickly as her ascent began, the narrative surrounding her shifted, not because of a lack of talent, but because of the invisible machinery of industry politics. In the early 2010s, a wave of online backlash surged after fans interpreted certain lyrics and tweets as references to Beyoncé, despite Hilson never confirming such intentions. The internet magnified the speculation, and fan-driven narratives solidified into something far larger than the original moment. Carrie later shared in interviews that she felt targeted by a storm she did not create and could not control. The intensity of the criticism, fed by a culture increasingly shaped by stan wars, created an environment where she felt cornered, misunderstood, and emotionally worn down. The conversation stopped being about her music, and instead became about assumptions, alliances, and an industry where silence is often survival. As opportunities tightened, Hilson stepped back, not out of defeat, but out of necessity. She spoke candidly in later years about her struggle with anxiety and depression during that period, explaining that the relentless scrutiny drained her passion for releasing new work. While many speculated about her absence, Hilson focused on healing. Her hiatus illuminated a brutal truth in modern entertainment. Public perception can shift overnight, and the consequences can linger for years. The same industry that once celebrated her versatility now seemed hesitant, as though waiting for a narrative to resolve itself. But Carrie Hilson refused to let the lowest moments define her. She returned gradually, acting in films, performing at select events, and reconnecting with fans through candor rather than spectacle. Her openness about mental health and the emotional cost of industry politics has inspired many who once only knew her as the voice behind radio hits. Behind the velvet curtain, Carrie's story is not one of downfall. It is a study in resilience in the face of invisible power structures. She remains a reminder that in show business, the loudest battles are often fought in silence, and surviving them can be an act of strength as profound as any chart-topping song. Ashanti. Ashanti entered the 2000s music scene with a quiet but undeniable force. Her self-titled debut album, released in 2002, sold over 503,000 copies in its first week, instantly breaking records and defining her as one of the decade's new superstars. Foolish Happy and her collaborations with Ja Rule dominated radio, shaping the sound of an entire era. To the public, she appeared untouchable, an artist who blended soulful vulnerability with commercial power. But beneath the shine, her rise was tied to a label whose stability was far more precarious than the glossy videos and platinum plaques suggested. Ashanti's ascent was closely connected to Murder, Inc., the powerhouse label led by Irv Gotti. When federal investigations targeted the company in the mid-2000s, centered on allegations completely unrelated to Ashanti, her career became collateral damage. She was never accused of any wrongdoing, yet the intense media attention surrounding the label cast a heavy shadow on everyone associated with it. Radio support cooled, industry partnerships grew complicated, and the once dominant empire around her began to fracture. For an artist still in her 20s, the turbulence felt like a punishment for circumstances entirely out of her control. Internally shifting alliances and creative disagreements added another layer of difficulty. As hip-hop evolved and former collaborators charted new paths, Ashanti faced the challenge of stepping out from Murder, Inc.'s identity and proving herself as an artist independent of the machine that had launched her. In later interviews, she spoke candidly about feeling misunderstood during this period, how headlines overshadowed her artistry, and how the industry's fast-moving attention left little room for patience or reinvention. The momentum of her early success slowed, not because her talent faded, but because the infrastructure around her collapsed. Yet Ashanti refused to let the turbulence define her. She continued making music independently, expanding into acting, and building a dedicated fan base through consistent touring. Her hits remained staples of the 2000s and were frequently sampled by new generations, affirming the lasting impact of her artistry. When she chose to re-record her debut album to reclaim ownership of her masters, she stepped into a new era of creative empowerment. Ashanti's story is one of endurance, a reminder that even when external forces try to derail a career, determination and authenticity can carve a path forward. Jennifer Hudson. Jennifer Hudson's rise in the mid-2000s felt nothing short of explosive. After capturing national attention on American Idol in 2004, she stunned the world with her Oscar-winning performance in Dreamgirls just 2 years later. Her voice, towering, soulful, unmistakable, marked her as one of the most gifted vocalists of her generation. By 2008, her debut album had entered the Billboard 200 at number 2, and her future seemed radiant. But behind the glow of her ascendance, an unimaginable tragedy was waiting, one that would alter her life more profoundly than fame ever could. In October 2008, Hudson's mother, Darnell Donnerson, her brother Jason Hudson, and her 7-year-old nephew Julian King were murdered in a case that shocked the nation. The perpetrator, William Balfour Hudson's former brother-in-law, was later convicted on multiple counts. A verdict reached after an exhaustive investigation and trial. For Jennifer, the news shattered her world. She withdrew from public life, leaning on her family, her faith, and an inner strength she later described as the only thing that kept me breathing. At a moment when her career was reaching extraordinary heights, grief pulled her into a silence deeper and darker than anything fame could shield her from. The path back was neither quick nor easy. Hudson has spoken candidly about the emotional devastation that followed the tragedy, the numbness, the fear, and the enormous weight of learning how to live again. Music, once her greatest joy, became both painful and therapeutic. When she returned in 2009 to perform the national anthem at the Super Bowl, the world witnessed not just a comeback, but a resurrection. Her voice carried a gravity born of both sorrow and resilience, reminding millions that healing is not a return to what was, but a courageous step into what remains. Jennifer Hudson did more than survive, she transformed. She went on to win a Grammy, starred in acclaimed film and television roles, and eventually achieved EGOT status, becoming one of the few artists in history to win an Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, and Tony. Through advocacy, philanthropy, and the Julian D. King Gift Foundation, created in memory of her nephew, she channeled her loss into service. Hudson's story is not defined by tragedy alone, but by the superhuman strength required to rise again. In the landscape of R&B and beyond, she stands as proof that even the deepest wounds cannot extinguish a spirit destined to shine. In the end, these stories are more than biographies. They are blueprints of survival proof that brilliance often comes with a hidden cost. From shattered expectations to industry politics, from private grief to public rebirth, each woman carved her legacy not by avoiding darkness, but by rising through it. Their journeys remind us that power is never simple and excellence is never effortless. As we celebrate their impact, one question remains for legends of Black excellence. Are these women honored for their strength, or has the industry relied on their suffering for far too long? Let the debate begin.